now it's time to look at the steps and logic of hypothesis testing, but we're only going to look at, we're going to look at the steps, but we're going to go through them very quickly. It's just to give you an overview. And then after we've had that overview, we're going to back up and we're going to look at each step in detail. So the first step in hypothesis testing is to state the null and the alternative hypothesis, either in words or in symbols. So state HO and HA. Now, the second step, we'll come back to this, so don't worry. The second step is to choose a value for alpha. Now, this is the symbol for alpha. Alpha is also called the level of significance. And you're going to see, when we go into detail, you're going to see it's like establishing a method establishing a method for a cutoff score. Remember that when we first learned about hypothesis testing, I said it's a technique that everybody's going to use, and everybody's going to play by the same set of rules, and ultimately the data themselves are going to tell you whether to reject or fail to reject HO. And it's based on whether your data meet a specific criteria. Well, alpha is the means through which we're going to be able to establish criteria that our data have to meet. Alpha is the means through which we're going to be able to get these cutoff scores that our data have to meet. All right, and so alpha is a pretty big deal, which is why we're going to spend a lot of time on it. The third step is to decide on which hypothesis test you want to run. You might remember from last class that we talked just very briefly about hypothesis tests. We called them hypothesis tests. We also called them inferential tests. You can also call them significance tests. They go by many different names. Regardless, depending on the nature of your experiment or study, you're going to have to choose a specific hypothesis test. So just to give you a little preview, some of them are called t-tests. And there's an independent t-test, a dependent t-test, a single sample t-test. Others are called ANOVAs. And there are different variations. There's a one-way independent ANOVA, one-way repeated ANOVA. Then there's two-way ANOVAs. I don't want to go on through the list, but there's all these different tests. And you have to pick the right one. And in Chapter 8, you're going to start learning about these individual tests and when they're appropriate. Because if you pick the wrong test, it's going to tell you nothing. If you are or suspect that you're pregnant, you take a pregnancy test. You don't take a vitamin D deficiency test, right? That's not going to tell you if you're pregnant or not. So it is important that you choose the correct test. Now, regardless of which one you choose, every single one of these tests end up calculating a statistic at the end, and we call it a test statistic, or TS for short. You have to remember that. Test statistic, TS for short, it is the number that gets calculated by a hypothesis test or by a significance test. All those names that I gave it before. Okay. Then what you're going to do, you're going to look at the actual value of this test statistic. All right. Usually, but not always, we're just interested in the size of the number, not whether it's positive or negative. But that's typically the case. But sometimes we do care if it's positive or negative in a way, and I'll talk about that later. So we're going to look at the value, how big or small the number is, and we're going to compare it to another test statistic, but this is a special one. It's called the TS critical. And essentially, the TS critical is just the cutoff score. So you're going to compare the TS that you calculated to this cutoff score, okay, that we call TS critical. And then you're going to apply a rule. If the TS that you calculated is larger than the TS critical, you're going to reject HO. All right? So if the one that you calculated is bigger than the cutoff value, reject HO. In other words, your test is saying you've got significant results. On the other hand, if your test statistic is less than TS critical, if it's less than the cutoff score, you're going to retain HO. In other words, your test is saying you've got non-significant results.